I've got two helpers. Sarah is hanging washing up, it looks like that, and Peter's on the PowerPoint. And I'm very grateful for Peter because I'm not at all gifted at technology and stuff, and he did that for me to take the stress off me. Thank you, Peter. I don't know if history is your thing, but you'll be glad to know this is a 50-minute overview from 1624. I hope some of you are I hope all of you will learn something new. I certainly did in the research. Now, there's no need, to scribble madly because we will make the PowerPoint available and also 2 levels of the script, if you like, the main script that I'm using, but also the research script with the links. And we'll make that available through TMF because there are quite a few sort of retired missionaries and whatever that would like to look. So just relax. In terms of history, obviously 50 minutes, I'm going to forget stuff. I'm going to get things wrong. I might forget your parents or something that's dear to your heart. That's the nature of this. I apologise up front. Even I was scribbling things that I had been told and I'd forgotten. I will probably get some things wrong, but I'm concentrating on the Protestant history. I won't mention the Roman Catholic side of things at all. And I hope we all learn something. At the last 10 minutes, just before we finish, I would like everyone to find a partner, and we will praise God for some of the things he's done in history and pray a little bit for Taiwan just for a few minutes. And at the end of every single one of the 8 main sessions this week, there will always be a little discussion and a little time of prayer, of the message, etc. We would really encourage you to do 8 different people to do the discussion with, because one of the main purposes of TMF is for us to get to know some of the other workers that we don't know, so that we can find out what other organisations are doing, because it's silly to keep reinventing the wheel. It's really good to learn from each other. And I would particularly encourage you, at least once this week in the 8 sessions, to find someone that's new. And you new folk, I would really appreciate it if you could put a little star on your name tag so that we know that you're new and that we want to make a special effort to make you feel at home, because it's easy just to talk to people we know that we're excited to see, especially this year when we haven't seen a lot of you very much. So let's start way back in the 1600s. In 1624, Dutch influence came into Taiwan. And along with it, it sort of was a mixture of business, the Dutch East Indies Company and the missionaries. And we had Dutch Reformed Protestant missionaries. I'm just going to mention 4 of them. They weren't here very long, about 40 years before that was sort of the Dutch went home. The first missionary that we're aware of had the interesting name of Georgius Candidius. And that's his claim to fame. He was the first guy. I don't know much about him. There was another guy called Daniel Gravius. He was a gifted linguist. He worked with the Dutch East India Company. Wasn't here long, but he started the first translation of a tribal language that I don't think exists anymore, called the Suraya language. The next guy's claim to fame, and I can't remember which one is which, is Antonius, they've got terribly difficult names if you're not Dutch, Hambrock. He is probably the first martyr. There was a governor called Coxinger, and he had this guy killed, first overseas martyr, and his daughter was taken as one of Coxinger's concubines. So that's a pretty hard thing to start to have your missionary career. And the reason that we even know about this, because we're talking 1630s, is because in the Netherlands it was quite a big deal, and they created a play. I think the painting, which is very small below, is a picture of that. So it was known because of the play. And then we had another guy who, it's reported that he baptised over 1,000 people. Now, I do not know if any of that first 1,000 baptisms in the 1600s existed and kept going in the Lord. But we will find out one day in glory, won't we? But it'd be really nice to think that some of those very early believers might have taught their children and gone on to the next generation, but I do not know. From the 1930s, sorry, I made you stand up there very early, Sarah, sorry. From the 1730s, from the adjacent province in China, they were encouraged they could migrate across here, and we began to go to get migrants coming across from China. And by 1824, we had 1.8 million migrants from China. So they brought their gods from China. So many of the temples you see in Taiwan are 300 years old. And some of the actual idols in them are carved 300 years ago and were brought across from China. And that's really the start of a lot of the folk religion here. Before that, mostly tribal people in the area and sort of pirates. So we're going to start with the era that we know a lot more about, and that's what I'm calling the Presbyterian era. And I just want to say something, and that is, if I mention your mission agency, can you maybe stand up at that point? So if we've got any Presbyterian representatives, now's your chance to stand up. We've lost David, the Alexanders, so I'm not sure if we have any more Presbyterians. Oh, yes, we do. Yes, here we go. Let's welcome the Presbyterians. Now, the Presbyterians were in China much earlier than they were here, and there was a guy called Carstairs Douglas, and he was a mission mobiliser, and he went back to the UK, and he encouraged people, and he said, look, I think you should go to Taiwan. The first modern missionary was James Laidlaw Maxwell. He arrived the 31st of December 1864, and within 6 months he'd planted the first Presbyterian church. So the Presbyterians count from the 16th of June 1865. He was quite a busy man. He also set up the first Western hospital, 1865, same date. And it was really the forerunner of the first Taiwan hospital, which is the Shinlo hospital next to the Tainan Theological Seminary. And I saw it a couple of weeks ago. But it only lasted 23 days the first time because local medicine people got jealous of this Western doctor and they attacked them. And Dr. Maxwell had to run away to Kaohsiung to save their lives, and it took quite a few years before he got back and restarted that clinic. Just recently, I read some a significant book, I thought, really enjoyed reading it. It's the letters of Hugh and Elizabeth Ritchie, who arrived in 1868. They were only here, he was only here 11 years, but really amazing what he did. Week by week by week, he walks around the Tainan Kaohsiung area sharing the gospel. One year he said he walked 2,000 miles. And we're talking dirt roads, muddy roads, and he's walking, doing a circuit in that area, sharing the gospel, examining people for baptism. I was very impressed by how they said, no, these folk didn't understand the gospel. But he records names, he records stories of people that burned their idols and were involved. And he also records the first Taiwanese martyrs of that time. And I love that fact because so many books, they record the Western martyrs, the missionary martyrs, but they don't record the locals. So many locals were beaten or burned on their places attacked. And this guy, Hugh Ritchie, you can read his letters, really interesting. 1868, they reached Xiaoliuqiu, and he talks of the first people in my area down in Donggang coming to the Lord. And very faithful, he died of cholera at age 39. But I thought that, and it's in English and it's in Chinese, that book. So that's something that the Tainan Theological Seminary, you can buy that book. It's a new book. with very old writing in it. Thomas Barclay, 1875. How are you going there, Sarah? Do you need another set of hands? You need another set of hands? Let us know if you need more help. We'll just get someone up. Thomas Barclay was a Presbyterian. He served 60 years in Taiwan, 1875 to 1935. And he died in Tainan and was buried there. And his funeral procession, I've seen a photo of it, amazing, like one of the God processions, except for a lot less noisy. But, you know, ox cart and everyone coming out, lots of people to honour this guy. What I was impressed about Thomas Barclay, the year after he arrives, he's out there and he's founding the Taiwan Theological Seminary. And I think I forgot to write that down. But 1896, the Tainan Theological Seminary, which is the first Presbyterian seminary and the first seminary. One of the things that impressed me when I went to visit it is it does not have a wall around it. And the reason for that is Thomas Barclay said, those training in ministry, I want the locals to be able to see in, to take away that sense of mystery. And I want the pastoral candidates to be able to see out and to remember why they're here. Those are the people out on the street that they've come for. And you can still go there, see the original buildings. And he basically worked there for 60 years. About this time too, we have, I missed a guy. That's okay, we'll get back to him. The most famous missionary in Taiwan, I think, early on is George Leslie Makai. He was a Canadian Presbyterian. And Makai, I think what they did is the Scottish and British Presbyterians stayed south and the Canadians went north. I don't know why. Maybe they realised there's a cultural difference between us. Let's divide and it will work out better. Makai went up the north and he's most famous here because he married a local, which in the 1870s was very unusual. He founded a clinic in 1880, and he also founded the first university for Taiwan, which was called Oxford College. It's now Athaleya University. And if you go and visit Danshui up in the north, you can see the statue of where he first landed. You can see some information about this university, which is still around. That first missionary, Maxwell, when he turned up, he came with a printing press. No one knew how to use it, but he said this is a significant piece of technology. And Thomas Barclay, on one of his home assignments, he thought, well, I better learn how to use that thing. And when he got back to Taiwan, Thomas Barclay, along with all the other things he did, founded the first Taiwanese newspaper. It was called the Taiwan Church News, and it was founded in 1885. Over the years, it was closed several times under the Japanese and whatever, but here we already have the first university, the first newspaper, the first Western hospital in the couple of the first decades. They were busy and amazing folk. Things were happening in Taiwan too. The late 1880s, we're beginning to get first roads. 1890s, the first railway. And along from the 60s, 70s, 80s, the Japanese are landing on the east coast and beginning to sort of lay down influence. And in 1895, there was a big war between China and Japan, the Sino-Japanese War, and China lost. And when they lost, they had to give up some of their land, and they thought, well, Taiwan's, it's a little bit separate. So they gave away Taiwan, and for 50 years, the Japanese ruled. So we're going on to the next era, which we just called the Japanese era. Red for the rising sun. Very soon after the Japanese arrived, Zhanghua Christian Hospital was founded. It's quite, is there anyone here that was born at Zhanghua Christian Hospital? There we go, Don was born there. My sister was born there. There were a couple of missionary doctors, father and son, that were there for many, many years. But it was influential. The Japanese brought a great stability. They were very technologically advanced, a real focus on education. Some of the Taiwanese looked back on the Japanese era as a great era, very secure. You didn't have to lock your doors, etc. But it was pretty tough on the tribal people. And basically they thought the tribal people were troublemakers, and they locked them up, kept them into the mountain areas, and for Christians in particular among the tribal people, very difficult. And if you ever want to go near Taroko Gorge, the bottom of Taroko Gorge, there's the, just remember her name, Jinwan or something like that, a memorial church, and you can go in there, and she was a tribal princess that was converted from the Taroko tribe, and she was, I remember a movie seeing as a child of the persecution that they went through, and they used to meet in caves with double entrances, and when the Japanese police were coming, they'd dash out the back. Lots of persecution for the tribal folk. 1899, Bank of Taiwan, and also the Shinlao Hospital, the new building hospital, was founded properly. And we're only up to, in the 1905, up to about 3 million in population, 82,000 tribal people, but most of them were these migrants that had come across from mainland China and already had lived here 100 years. Thomas Barclay, meanwhile, is busy. He supervises with lots of local people. Another thing I liked about Thomas Barclay is the number of local pastors that he trained up very early, full colleagues with him. There's photos at the Taiwan Theological Seminary, and they now have a research centre with a lot of these research materials, early stuff, diaries, things, in a special temperature-controlled research place, and you can go in there and do research if that's what you're interested in. Another thing I loved about Thomas Barclay is every year he would renew his commitment to glorifying Jesus. And you go into that centre and they've got a desk with his signature year after year after year. I think he did this commitment from age of 16 every year until he died in 1935. When he got married, his wife's signature joins him, and when she dies, it stops. But there you have this man renewing his commitment. This year, I will glorify Jesus. I renew my commitment to follow him. 1916, the Taiwanese, which they called Amoy in those days, Romanized New Testament was published. And basically the Presbyterians, as far as I can see, are the missionaries that have been here up until 1926. And this is when Reverend Kilbourne of the OMS decides to do a bit of survey in Taiwan, originally called the Oriental Missionary Society. Now we're calling it the One Mission Society. Sounds like the One Ring. The One Mission Society. If you're OMS, can you stand up? The Dinagers are here. Oh, yes. The same year, 1926, the Japanese Holiness Church sends a missionary here. I'm not sure if his surname is Reverend An or Reverend Fu, but I'm guessing, is Japanese. And Taiwan is Japanese, so it's easy for him to come. And we have a Japanese missionary, as far as I can see, coming across and working in Taiwan. They had quite a lot of persecution during World War II. Generally, I'm not naming a lot of names, and I'll name less and less as I go, only because once I start naming names, where do you end? But one couple that I think are quite well known, their names are Lillian and James Dixon. They arrived in 1927. They're still Presbyterians, Canadian Presbyterians, but they're well known for their work, which was with a lot of young people, high schoolers. Lillian lived a long, long time, all the way, so served from 1927 to 1981. founded the Mustard Seed organisation that works with medical work and orphans and polio and these kind of things. I can remember that name very clearly when I was a child. Thomas Barclay keeps working. 1932, the whole New Testament, Taiwanese New Testament, comes out, again Romanized. And Taiwan's getting up to 5 million people in 1935 when he dies. And 1935 is Taiwan's biggest earthquake. Despite the fact that the later earthquake, which we think of as big, there were lots of high buildings, this is low buildings, it must have been pretty massive. 7.1 on the Richter scale, 3,276 Taiwanese died. And as they're mostly living in low buildings, that's a very significant death rate. It must have been massive. And here's another amazing thing the Japanese did. 1943, compulsory primary education starts. And they reached 71% enrolment in the 1940s, which was the second highest in Asia after Japan, of course. And then the bombs were dropped. Japanese surrendered, humiliated, they went home. And there's a 5-year period, immediate post-war, where Taiwan is in chaos. And the reason we're in chaos is that Taiwan is returned to China after 50 years, and the communists have been battling Chiang Kai-shek and the Republican forces in China for years, well over a decade. And Chiang Kai-shek and all his soldiers withdrew to Taiwan, and it must have been absolute and utter chaos. They started arriving in 1948. But just before that, Taiwan's population has now gotten up to 6.5 million. We have the first Baptist missionary arrives, I think, June 1948, Pastor Young. I think he's a mainland Chinese, that's from what I understand. So we have a mainland Chinese missionary coming across from China to bless Taiwan, 1948. And he starts the first Baptist work here. I love these Japanese and Chinese that are coming across and beating lots of the Westerners. And we have a very significant incident that must have happened just before the main part of the army came, but there must have already been some folk here. The 28th of February 1947, some sort of small argument about the selling of illegal cigarettes. A Taiwanese man gets killed and there's mass riots that break out. And to this day, they still don't know how many died. I think there's an official figure and there's the real figure, which is many thousands. And this 28th of February incident was very significant in Taiwan, a lot of bitterness. And the reason they were bitter was that the Japanese, the foreigners left, and then the people they considered their own people treated them worse than the Japanese in their view. A great deal of disillusionment, anger, even into the 90s. You weren't allowed to talk about this. And then when Chen Shui-bian became president, it was celebrated as a sort of a public memorial day, 28th of February. And now it can be talked about more normally, but it's still a touchy issue. But Chiang Kai-shek begins to flood across with this great exodus. And of course, what he's doing is withdrawing to Taiwan. The plan was always for him just to withdraw, regroup, and then forge back to China and take over as the legitimate Republic of China. Must have been chaos. Naval ships, 80 flights, 2 million soldiers were coming. I'm not sure if, actually, there might have been migrants in there. They brought gold from the treasury. They brought all the wonderful treasures from the palaces. And you can still see these things in the National Palace Museum. You must go if you've never been. It's an amazing museum. the reality, the mainland Chinese get mad about it, but the reality is if the communists would have destroyed most of those treasures. So I'm glad they're here because they're worth seeing. And into this chaos, the first Southern Baptist missionary arrives, October 1948, Bertha Smith. So the Southern Baptists, we've got any of you, if you could stand up. Yep, okay. Southern Baptists used to be, I think, the biggest organisation in Taiwan. By 1987, there were 118 missionaries. Been involved in church planting, a lot of seminary involvement. By November 1948, there were 31,000 refugees every week arriving. And you can guess, they're not coming evenly spread out. They're coming into Geelong and Taipei, I would imagine. Absolute chaos, traumatised people, hungry people, people that don't speak Taiwanese, and they're just flooding in here, and it was really difficult for Taiwan. Into that chaos, June 1941, they introduced the new Taiwan dollar, and they moved the capital up to Taipei. And really, many of the local people, they thought, oh, our motherland, it's come here, things are going to be great, we're now going to be in leadership, we're going to be respected as the locals, and they really were very disappointed because the jobs, the government, went to Chiang Kai-shek and his folk, and they were really in power for about 40 years. The only government party, you were Kuomintang, and that's what you were. And there were no, you had elections, but you could only vote those guys in anyway. And these old soldiers getting older and older. And the Taiwanese were very, very resentful. And many of them spoke up, and many of them went as political prisoners across to Green Island, where they just died. I've been there, seen some of the things. It was a horrible time. And many Taiwanese people very disappointed. And missionaries were coming into this chaos because, of course, they were tossed out of China. So most of the early missions and mission agencies that arrived sort of 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, these were ex-mainland Chinese missionaries, traumatised, hoping that this was a temporary posting, learning new languages, learning to adapt. Is this temporary? Is it longer? And I wanted to read just a little bit from what was life like in 1950. This is a team missionary, Arthur, another funny name, Geeble. This is what he said. We lived in a Japanese-style wooden house with a tile roof. We had electricity from sunset until 11 p.m. and there was limited plumbing with a pump, one of these pumps, outside. Our refrigerator was an ice box. The ice was supplied from the fishing port. They did have an electric washing machine and iron, but it could only be used at night, and often the generator failed anyway, so it wasn't much use. So we're going to move on to 1951 to 1970, and these were the revival days. When things are chaotic, often people are more open spiritually, and that was the case then. We begin to have a whole stream of missionary agencies arriving. They're not in any particular order. Maybe I've been a little bit preferential and put 1951 CIM, China Inland Mission, which is now OMF, arrived. In typical fashion, OMF actually wrote and said, we have no plans to go to Taiwan. They were planning to go back. China Inland Mission, of course, we're going back into China. But a couple of single ladies never listened. And they were here already. And Ruth Novak was here and Ellen Geeble. They just basically came on their own without official endorsement. And they were already working here before China Inland Mission said, oh, well, I guess they're already there. We better get, and everyone else is going, so we'll go. And TMF Conference started as early as this. It started out of a prayer meeting, and it started a conference. I think this is the first conference. Let me just read a little bit about it. It met on Yangmingshan the first year, and one of the speakers was Dr. Nelson Bell, Billy Graham's father-in-law. The speakers were ex-missionaries from China. For recreation, they hiked up to the sulfur pits on Yangmingshan, but the crowning event was afternoon tea with Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek. And they got Western ice cream, which of course she never got. Now, dear Chiang Kai-shek couldn't speak any English, but his wife was very well educated, and she was a keen Christian, and she talked with a lot of them. And I will just go on a little bit about TMF and come back to the other things in a minute. Early conferences were held up at Sun Moon Lake, and they hired different rooms at hotels, sleeping on tatami, Japanese grass matting. They had a pump organ for singing, usually 2 speakers each morning and another speaker at night. And then all the afternoon they'd go swimming in the lake. And there used to be an island, and well, there probably still is an island, and they would swim, the better swimmers would race each other around the island. Boat rides, lots of fun things on the water. And of course, in those days, no telephones, no communication in between. So it was a time particularly to talk English and to have prayer times together. And they talk about how important those prayer times were. They could never afford an outside speaker, of course, one because, it was still travelling by ship, and because of the cost. So it was always local speakers. And one of the missionaries describes Taichung City in the early 50s. There were only 2 private cars in the whole city, and that would have been high-up generals. There was one missionary that had an air conditioner. We cycled everywhere and cooked on a charcoal stove. We lived in a Japanese-style tatami house with a pit toilet and a night soil man who would come and collect your sewerage. This guy, Alan Cole, he took baths after dark in the yard, so as not to scare the locals. Cooking, you had a small propane burner, but you had to get that from Chiayi. The gas came from Chiayi, so you had to be organised. And you had a small tin oven, sort of probably a reflective thing that you could make your own bread, because of course there was no bakeries. Late 50s, he describes their meals on the east coast, Changong, as bean sprouts, lotus root, cabbage and rice were our main diet during the summer when it was too hot to grow green vegetables. We bought fish from the harbour, fatty pork and some scrubby chicken, and an occasional good meal of sea turtle. Meanwhile, other missions were arriving. November 1952, the Conservative Baptists, now we call them World Venture. We've got some of you folk here, just stand up for us. Stand or wave. Yep. Oh, there's quite a lot of them. Okay. And again, the first 8 workers, they're all ex-China. So they've experienced in China and they're coming across. 1952, we also had the first CMA, and those 2 ladies with the map in the photo are CMA. They quickly got to work. The CMA is one of the smaller compared to the Southern Baptists. The height of their numbers, they had in 1990 29 career missionaries. Currently there are about 26. Did we get the CMA folk to wave or stand up? Yep, the Luz and Hong Yu. Yep. And we've also got the Lutheran Brethren. But I'm not sure, have we got any of you folk this year? The Christophersons and... Yep. And again, these folk are coming in, the first ones are coming in from China. A small organisation, but focusing nowadays on the Hakka ministry. These are the folk to talk about Hakka and Hakka music ministry. And learning 2 or 3 different dialects here. Smaller group. 6 to start, about 9 nowadays, or at the peak. Okay, about August 1952, we have people recognising four organisations, including OMS and TEAM. I'm not going to see it in front of me at the moment, but we need a school, they said. So the first school was one teacher. Her name was Edna Merritt, and 6 students. And they met in a very simple, a bamboo hut on the OMS compound in Taichung. But the next year, August 1953, it gets an official name. It was called, Morrison was first called the Taiwan Evangelical Christian School. And it started that the second year, I think, with 35 students. And they called it Morrison after Robert Morrison, the first missionary, famous missionary to China. In those days, monthly tuition at Morrison was $12. I'm presuming it's $12 US. And if you're a missionary, it was $10 a month to send your kids, plus the cost of books and board. It was about $1.25 for board per day. The Conservative Baptists were also one of those missions. And they were in rented accommodation for the beginning. 1956, the first graduating class with 3 graduates. I think they were all boys. In fact, do we have a photo? That must be the first teacher with the 6 children there on that photo. The Baptists got busy, and September 1952, we have the Baptist Theological Seminary, Taiwan Baptist Theological Seminary formed. TEAM also opened a little Bible Institute on the property, the Trailblazer camp at Dajia, which we still use as a campsite. There must have been a real need for TMF Conference because there were 200 missionaries meeting by 1954. It also shows you how quickly the number of missionaries were coming, a lot of them ex-China. And by 1956, we have the Bible Society established, and they did the Bible translation. This is an international organisation. They've done a lot of the tribal languages over many, many years. Something else happened in 1956. TLI, Taipei Language Institute, was formed. How many of us studied Chinese at TLI? My parents were the first OMFers allowed to go, and I know that they were basically told, this is not how it is done in this China Inland Mission. If you don't do really well, because they'd always had language helpers for, 60 years, if you don't do it well, then no other students in the OMF will be allowed to go to language school. So the pressure was on. But thank goodness TLI stayed there. It's trained many people, including many, many secular folk. Many of the teachers don't know the Lord, and year after year after year, missionaries get a chance to share with their teachers. And it's a great place to keep praying that the gospel will reach out there. I think I might get this date wrong. Someone correct me. I think Doris, and I can never say her surname, Braun, anyway, Doris, Heavenly Melody, I think she arrived in 1957. She's still here. So this is the oldest living missionary, longest serving, still here. On Wednesday night we'll have a concert. And the last couple of years I don't think Doris has been able to come. But I can remember quite her coming and playing the trumpet. And pretty amazing lady, what God's enabled her to use. And I thought, since that's such a long time ago, that her name needed to be mentioned. It'll be quite some funeral, I would say, when she goes to glory. And one of the very early CIM missionaries was Ellen Geeble, and she worked down in Taichung, and this is what she had to say. Being the only foreigner living there, I naturally was quite a curiosity. I lived in a 3-room mud house covered with fine crushed stone and with a thatched roof. A native house in every appearance, but clean and light inside. She had visitors, tribal, Chinese, which in those days they called mainlanders, or Formosan Taiwanese folk. They seemed to feel at home. I was able to help in the Formosan church and also in the Mandarin-speaking small church. Women's work, children's work, outdoor Sunday school work, usually under trees. Saturday nights, I had 80 children coming to my home for an hour children's meeting, and I did that for 9 years. Many children accepted the Lord. Many mainland soldiers were stationed there in Taitung. Many tracts and Gospels of John were given out as well, and she was able to obtain Braille Bibles for some of the blind soldiers. By the 1950s and into the 60s, we have more medical work happening. We have the foundation of the Pingdong Christian Hospital. We have a Norwegian missionary called Olav Bojorges, and he also started a polio home. And polio was very common in Taiwan in the 60s and 70s up to the 80s. And he was also involved in a special surgery that was a spine straightening surgery. And Pingdong Christian Hospital became one of 8 renowned hospitals in the entire world for this particular surgery. So many medical things were developed in Taiwan because of whatever particular sicknesses here. There was a forgotten what that black one was called, black swamp fever or something, Blackfoot. I've seen the research for that. There was leprosy, there was TB, there were lots of things. And so it gave lots of doctors practice with things they hadn't seen before. Now, I called this section Revival Days, and account after account talks of very common 40 to 50 baptisms at a time. In fact, so many became Christians that many of the missionaries believed that by 1960, 10% of the population would be Christian. That was just the general belief. It must have been amazing. And a lot of them were these mainlander soldiers who came here they were just men, without their wives. They never saw their families again. They had kids back in China, never saw them again. A lot of them then married much younger Taiwanese or tribal women and had a second family. Population's getting up to about 10 million in the 1958. And in the 1960s, TMF Conference moved to the Morrison campus. Now, I forgot to mention when Team arrived, forgotten it again, I think it was 1950-something. But in the 1960s, Team did a lot of work. They started mobile clinics over on Taidong's side. We ended up with the Taidong Christian Hospital, which was called Loganfell Memorial Hospital. Girls' homes, orphanages, a Bible college, Amos tribal work, and got Frank Dennis over there running a lot of polio and TB clinics. Things were happening politically too. 1964, Taiwanese language is banned in all schools. This led to a huge amount of resentment. And until the Democratic People's Party elections where they won government in 1990, basically from 1948 to 1990, the Taiwanese-speaking people were really pushed down. One of the reasons that the Presbyterian Church has been so influential was that they insisted on Taiwanese and they kept the Taiwanese language alive. They did quite a lot of political stuff in the background. I remember when one of the tribal languages, it might have been Paiwan, was translated. It was illegal to have tribal languages. Christians ignored that kind of rule. And my bedroom was full of boxes of the Paiwan Bible, which was paid for by a non-Christian man. He donated a huge amount of money, a South African guy. I remember particularly because he handed my dad, along with the money, he handed all of these polished tiger's eyes stones from South Africa and sort of handed them to my dad. I don't know who the man was. I don't think he was a believer. And we kept these things in my bedroom, and Dad used to go out with the tribal pastors out late at night, delivering them after dark. I think Mum and Dad probably would have been expelled. They probably didn't tell OMF what they were doing. Anyway, they just got on with it. There were several times my parents got in trouble. I also need to mention that 1967, first Send missionaries arrived. So if we could get the Send folk to wave or stand up, that would be great. They majored with working with Hakka and Taiwanese. And this is an interesting organisation because it was really founded in the Philippines, working in the Philippines and Japan. So it's like the Holiness Church and OMS, it's got a more Asian-based start. 1968, compulsory education goes from primary school, elementary school, up to the end of grade 9. And 1969, Ted and Beverly Skiles arrived. So they're our second longest serving missionaries. They're here every year. But this year they're in isolation for 2 weeks, and it's a real pity that they're not here. They founded an organisation called the Formosan Christian Mission, which later, and I forgot to write down the date, I think it's 1980-something, became Team Expansion. So the folk with that organisation, if you could stand up, Team Expansion and Formosan Christian Mission links. And the last thing, I've fairly randomly divided these eras up. Some of them are random and some of them are like the Japanese era, it's obvious, that one. But 1970, another theological seminary, the China Evangelical Seminary, was founded, and it's just moved from Taipei to Taoyuan. They've got a brand new campus there. Very highly regarded, with I think probably lots of students come in from overseas there too. We ready? How are you going there, Sarah? I haven't even looked at you. Well done. Okay, it's great to have such helpers. We're now into 1971, and I've now sort of changed this all the way to 2000, but I had it originally in 2 eras. But Taiwan in the 1970s was becoming very urbanised. And we began these amazing 5 years or 10 years of huge engineering projects, including the North-South Freeway, 375 kilometres of freeway. It was completed in 7 years. Taiwan's amazing. And when you think that the whole thing is elevated with all of those cloverleaf on and off ramps, it was quite some feat. And that's only one of 10 major projects. And it was pretty famous, and I remember getting pretty excited because I think there were 6 aircraft runways. It could be converted in the time of war. They would just pull out the central poles. You can still see a couple of areas where it's possible, and they could convert this thing into aircraft for the Air Force runways. Brilliant idea. I put 1971, the Onesiphorus Polio Home. Some of these things you get because I remember them. But there were lots of team missionaries out there. I think it was team. And the Taidong they had lovely English service out there. We used to go out there often. And the Polio Home, children's home, it's still there. It's a sort of an orphanage that's not an orphanage nowadays. Often kids have parents, but their parents can't look after them for some reason. And that's where the Andersons? Yeah, the Andersons still serve. 1972, Morrison moved to the current site. And in those days, there were about 500 students, but 60% of them were from the American military families. And shortly after that, they all pulled out, so it must have been a sudden drop in numbers. And I have a special slide for a funny social piece of history. 1972 was the production of the Tips and Treats recipe book. Is it still available through TMF? I still use Beverly Skiles' banana cake recipe, and it is usually at the OMF conference every year. But the thing about the Tips and Treats was it had a list of things with sort of a Romanized Chinese of things that you could buy, how to, baking soda and obscure terms that you didn't learn at language school. So you could go and find these things. And there were also weird recipes for things like soap and candles and how to make, you can't get chocolate, so this is what you can do to substitute. I still use mine all the time. And Mum gave me her copy when I came to Taiwan. Population is really going up. We're reaching 16 million by 1975. And more people are migrating into the cities for opportunities with education and jobs, particularly noticeable with tribal people who are abandoning the tribal villages, leaving the old people and their grandchildren there, and mum and dad are moving to the cities. 1976, Bethany School, which was established previously, merged with Morrison. And Makai started, Kaohsiung campus, and it had 33 students and 3 teachers. I think in the late 70s or maybe 1980, Billy Graham came to Taipei for campaigns. And I got a letter here that says, my father took a group of tribal pastors there, and one of them was a really terrible man who had been in prison, and he didn't have anywhere to stay, so he used to stay overnight at the stadium so that he wouldn't miss it. And his life was totally transformed, and he went on to be really helpful in the Taiwan work. Another young man went to find a nice girlfriend. He thought that was the place to look for a girlfriend. He became a Christian through the Billy Graham crusade, went back to his village, and a few months later he wrote asking for someone to come and baptise some people. So my dad and a couple of tribal pastors went and discovered 130 people ready for baptism. They stayed up all night examining the candidates, checking that they understood the gospel, and the next day baptised 100 of them. But in the late 1970s, in the tribal work, lots of tribal people were moving, and so the decision was made for tribal pastors to move to the city, and none of them wanted to go. But they prayed together and they said, look, unless we do this will be the end of the tribal Christians, because there's no tribal language churches in the cities. So they came into the big cities, and within a few short years, 35 tribal churches of different languages were established in Taipei area. And they were part of the Presbyterian Church, and they used to just rent little flats, apartments high up, no lifts, walking up there, Sunday schools on the roof, and it was fairly basic. Okay, I think are we on to the... Ooh. Can we just flip on to the next one, which I'm going to do the research. Yeah, 1980, quite a significant book came out. Alan Swanson, who I think was Lutheran, produced 3 significant books. The most significant one, I think, was the Mending the Nets, still worth reading. And he basically researched why are people becoming Christians and then leaving through the back door? How do we stop the holes in the nets? How do we stop people? And he did lots of good research. Very interesting reading. And I wanted to mention George McFall's maps. They're much later, but this is just a research slide. Just to remind us that sometimes missionary work, the research is really, really important, can have a big influence. And if you're thinking of doing a PhD, I think it would be really great to replicate some of the 1980s research on mending the nets, why the back door, how people come to Christ. There's lots of good stuff. And research is important, and it benefits the whole lot of us. So if that's a gifting that you've got a burden for it. It has blessed us in the past. We'd really love that kind of thing to happen. Think about it if that's your thing. It's not everyone's thing, but it's good. Okay, we'll go back, Peter. We're going sort of 1980 to 2000 here. How are we going? Yeah, we're going well for time. we're already getting up to 19 million. So the current population is probably getting close to 24 million. So we've got lots and lots of people here. 1987, martial law is lifted. Okay, 38 years of martial law. Basically what it meant was that you couldn't be on beaches after dark. You were silly enough to go enjoy the beach and you got home late, you could get shot. There were all sorts of military, you can still see those, what are they called, the concrete bunker things. There were sorts of restrictions. You were not allowed to have any public demonstrations. If you innocently took photos and you happened to be within a mile of a military installation, a policeman would jump in front of you and stop you taking photos. You didn't notice it most of the time, but it was there. 1992, now where have I put this? Have we got the Thai stuff? I'll come back to it. Let me just keep going. I'll come back to the Thai stuff. We've got, about 1995, we've got Christian radio, Good News Radio. And at the end of that time, 1998, we've got the Good News TV launches. It was a very local thing, but by 2002, it was available all over Taiwan, and now it reaches the Chinese world. It reaches about 1.4 million people every month in over 180 countries. Chinese are well spread out. 1996 was also very influential because we had the first more democratic election, and Chen Shui-bian was elected. And he was Taiwanese, very Taiwanese, didn't have great sounding Mandarin. He had been a political prisoner, and everyone was very excited. Can we go to the slide? I want to mention the outreach to other nationalities. So we began to have lots of foreign workers in Taiwan, and I wanted to mention, yeah, that's good, they're a lot bigger. 1992, more official work outreach to the Thai. Maybe it was happening before, but they now have 21 full-time missionaries working in this organisation. And in the past 30 years, 2,700 Thais have believed and returned to Thailand. They have 3 big camps a year, 2 in Taiwan and 1 for returnees in Thailand. An amazing ministry to people that are much more open in our country, Taiwan, than perhaps in their own country. And although the Vietnamese ministry does not fit in this time, it really started about 2003, I've put it on the same page just to say the Vietnamese folk, about 40 of them attended a Thai camp with translation, and many became Christians, and now there's a separate work to Vietnamese with about 10 full-time workers. Those of you that are involved in this ministry, and we've got lots of our Asian brothers and sisters who get translation because they're Thai or Vietnamese. So if our Thai and Vietnamese group or Filipino workers, if they could stand up, that would be great. Emmanuel and his wife. Now, in many of our areas, we have Thai and Vietnamese and Indonesians. These are the folk to contact. They've got the literature. There might be a fellowship in the area. They might be able to help setting up a fellowship, send out a worker to your area. So this is just to let you know. Have you got a table at the foyer this year? There's always a table to find out more. And the other thing that, I'm going to do that later. I'll do the other later. I'll go back to the end of the 90s. Got some big engineering projects. We have we've got the Taipei Mass Rapid Transport, MRT, beginning to open in 1998 and 3 lines by 2000, made a huge difference to Taipei. I remember when it got so bad, the traffic, you actually had to leave at 5 a.m. to get anywhere. And the traffic jams were so bad that people would just start kicking the vehicles. and your vehicles would just have these big dents in it. It was horribly stressful. So the MRT was a big thing. We also have the 9/21 earthquake, where with the loss of 2,415 lives. A little bit smaller than the other one, but very massive, and many of us remember those days. And there were so many people, and we need so many things that we also put in a new freeway, a second freeway in the beginning of the 2000s. How are you going there? Okay, I think we're into the 2000s, nearly done. I want to mention the prison ministry. Now, the prison ministry, we do have local prison ministries. The one I'm talking about is the foreign one. They work with foreigners that are stuck in prison, many Asian folk, even Westerners. They visit people. But we also have people working in prisons and detention centres. Can we just sort of have a wave if we've got some of you here? Will? Yep. So lots of good ministry happening there. More engineering. The high-speed rail comes in 2006. Huge project. And the Kaohsiung MRT, 2008. And hopefully next year, the Taichung will have a bit of MRT as well. I asked the taxi driver. And we had quite a significant flood and disaster, Baba Shui Zai, in 2009 with 700 dead, including an entire village which just got buried, and they said, well, we just can't dig them, find the bodies. We're just going to bury over it, make it a garden, a memorial garden. I realise I've forgotten, what have I forgotten? I've forgotten the mention of the Christian relief organisation that was started by a local man at the end of the 90s, just in time really for the mid to end of 90s. God provided it ready for the earthquake, the big earthquake, and it was a huge impact. And I think we've reached the end. I've reached my end. So what I'd like us to do, just for 5 or 10 minutes, just a short while, I want you to do 2 things. Find a partner. You can stand up. You've been sitting a long time. Move around, even on the stage if you like. I want you to praise God for some of what he's done since 1624. This is a tiny snapshot. He's done a lot more than we know. Who knows what Christians he washed up on these shores or shipwrecked here so that they'd share their faith. He's done a lot. I've forgotten organisations. I've forgotten significant people. If you really want to put something up, I think we've got some extra pieces of paper and you can write something down and tag it on the line. I haven't forgotten you because I don't like you or whatever. It's just I'm being human. Let's praise God for what he's done, what he's doing. And then let's pray for something about Taiwan. It might be a seminary or a hospital or something that's on your heart. And pray that we would be faithful in our generation. Some of those older folk that were here in the 1800s, some of them were here for four or 5 years, and yet God used them. So he can use us in a short time. We might be some of these unusual 50 or 60-year missionaries. They're pretty rare. But I always think so important for us to be faithful and not to bring dishonour to God's name. Because when a missionary commits major sin that results in dishonour and gets sent home, or we're really proud or arrogant or whatever, it really brings dishonour. So let's pray for ourselves that we would be faithful, God-honouring folk, and that we would take the baton from the people before us and we would pass it on to the next generation, however long we're here, and that we would remember that we're part of a much bigger picture, and this isn't all of us either. We've got all the local folk faithfully serving. This year, keep encouraging them. So let's pray and thank God and pray together, and then let's go and chat over at the outside the cafeteria there in the outside area.